Good morning, everyone. I'm Alexis Jay, and I'm the chair of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. With me are the other members of the panel of the inquiry, Professor Sir Malcolm Evans, Ivor Frank, and Drusilla Sharpling. On behalf of the inquiry, I welcome you all to the first day of the substantive hearing in the inquiry's investigation into allegations of child sexual abuse linked to Westminster. This hearing will run for 3 weeks, with a non-sitting week in the week commencing the 18th of March, finishing on Friday the 29th of March 2019. The investigation into Westminster is a part of the inquiry's wider investigation into institutional failures in connection with the abuse of children in England and Wales. As you all know, the task of the chair and panel of the inquiry is to examine the extent to which public and private institutions in England and Wales have failed to protect children from sexual abuse in the past and to make meaningful recommendations to keep children safe today and in the future. On behalf of the inquiry, I am, as always, grateful to all core participants and their legal teams for their assistance. I understand that a great deal of work has gone into preparing witness statements and providing disclosure. To those who have provided witness statements or who are to be called to give live evidence before the inquiry during this hearing, we are grateful to you. I want to assure you of the high priority that the inquiry places on this investigation and on hearing of your experiences. Before we hear from leading counsel to the inquiry, Brian Altman, Queen's Counsel, who will introduce the representatives present and open the investigation hearing. Finally, I would like to reiterate what I've said on previous rulings in this investigation about the expectation that all participants in these hearings, as in all inquiry hearings, will be courteous and respectful to other participants. In addition, the panel and I would like to emphasise that witnesses to this inquiry and their families must be treated with respect by the media and others. They should not be the subject of unwanted attention or harassment from anyone. Unless a witness deliberately makes contact with the media of their own volition, any such attention should be regarded as unwanted. Please respect their right to privacy. Please go ahead with your opening statement now, Mr. Altman.
Thank you, Chair. Well, Chair, today you and the panel begin 3 weeks of hearings in the Westminster investigation, which is but one part of the statutory independent inquiry into child sexual abuse set up by the then Home Secretary in March 2015, offering an unprecedented opportunity to examine the extent to which institutions and organisations in England and Wales have taken seriously their responsibility to protect children. May I first make introductions of those who are present and represented before you today. As, of course, is clear to you, Chair and panel, I am Brian Altman, Queen's Counsel, lead counsel to the inquiry. I appear with Mr. Andrew O'Connor, Queen's Counsel, who is lead counsel to the Westminster investigation, and we are assisted by Miss Kate Beattie, Mr. Alistair Henderson, and Miss Katie O'Byrne. The Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, is represented by Miss Zoe Johnson, Queen's Counsel, the Labour Party by Miss Eleanor Gray, Queen's Counsel, the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the IOPC, is represented by Miss Lorna Skinner, the Metropolitan Police, or the MPS as we shall refer to it occasionally, by Miss Samantha Leake, Queen's Counsel, Wiltshire Police by Miss Anne Studd, Queen's Counsel, the Home Office, which has been granted core participant status in a representative capacity for Her Majesty's Government, is represented by Mr. Nicholas Griffin, Queen's Counsel, a group of 7 complainants whose ciphers are listed in the list of core participants are represented by Mr. Richard Scorer. Miss Esther Baker is represented by Mr. Jonathan Price. Mr. Tim Hulbert by Mr. Sam Steen, Queen's Counsel. And finally, Mr. Harvey Proctor is represented by Mr. Geoffrey Robertson, Queen's Counsel. Chair, today you are going to be hearing opening statements from us as well as from core participants. Tomorrow you will start hearing the evidence. The evidence will continue for the rest of this week and all of next week, the third week in March. The week commencing the 18th of March, as you have said, is a non-sitting week for the inquiry. We will resume in the final week of March for further evidence, and at the end of that week, closing submissions. The central issue that this investigation will address is whether Westminster institutions have failed, and indeed whether they are still failing, to protect children. Questions have been asked as to how Westminster institutions, be they political parties, government departments, law enforcement, or intelligence agencies, have responded to allegations of child sexual abuse and exploitation, whether political parties turned a blind eye to allegations of child sexual abuse made against their members or their leaders, or whether there were attempts to cover such allegations up. In the case of the whip's offices, whether they in fact tried to turn such allegations to their advantage, whether members of the Westminster establishment sought to influence policing or prosecution decisions in cases of child sexual abuse, whether there was a culture whereby people of public prominence were shielded from investigation and their wrongdoing tolerated at the expense of their victims. We shall investigate and attempt to answer these questions, which have given rise to considerable public concern. And these are extremely serious issues. You and the panel will, of course, be familiar with similar issues from your other investigations. You've now heard evidence about institutional complacency towards allegations of child sexual abuse, and worse, in a variety of different contexts. The gravity of these issues in this investigation, we suggest, lies in the fact that they relate directly to the alleged conduct of elected representatives. If true, they affect public confidence in the individuals and in the institutions responsible for running the country. Notwithstanding the gravity of these issues, we are conscious that some will ask whether the inquiry really needs to investigate them at all. Critics might say that the public concern about these matters that existed a few years ago, in particular at the time of the wave of allegations relating to Jimmy Savile, Cyril Smith, as well as others, has now abated. A number of other investigations have taken place, and Carl Beach, formerly known as Nick, whose allegations about a so-called Westminster paedophile ring in Dolphin Square in London at one time attracted so much publicity, is now awaiting trial on charges which he denies of perverting the course of justice and fraud in connection with the allegations he made. Chair, I hope that everything else that I have to say this morning will justify the value of this investigation. But there are two brief points that I would make straight away. First, let me explain the inquiry's position relating to the allegations made by Carl Beach, or Nick, of a Westminster paedophile ring operating in Dolphin Square. As is well known, the Metropolitan Police investigation into Mr. Beach's allegations, Operation Midland, ended with no charges being brought. A detailed investigation into Operation Midland was conducted by a retired High Court judge, Sir Richard Henriques. At the end of 2016, Sir Richard published a report that made a series of criticisms of the Metropolitan Police relating to the way in which Operation Midland had been conducted. And as I have said, Mr. Beach has now himself been charged with offences arising from the allegations he made. You will recall that the first preliminary hearing in this investigation in January last year, long before Mr. Beach was charged, we submitted that Mr. Beach's allegations, and more importantly, the institutional response to those allegations, shouldn't form part of this investigation. We suggested that public concern relating to those allegations had diminished, and we made the point that the way in which the police responded to Mr. Beach's allegations had already been thoroughly examined by Sir Richard Henriques. There was no dissent to these submissions, and as we shall see, the ruling that you gave on scope in May last year identified a series of other matters for this investigation to address. The criminal proceedings that have now been brought against Mr. Beach add a further and more compelling reason why this investigation shouldn't touch either on the allegations that Mr. Beach has made or on Operation Midland. It's plainly imperative that nothing that we do as part of this investigation prejudices in any way the fairness of those criminal proceedings. However, and this is the second point, it's our firm submission that public concern over Westminster child sexual abuse allegations neither begins nor ends with Mr. Beach. We suggest, and we are confident that many of the core participants here today will agree, that there are outstanding questions of public concern in this area that is both necessary and appropriate for this inquiry to investigate, albeit in a limited and proportionate manner. Those are the issues that you identified in your ruling on scope in May of last year. It's those issues that we will investigate, and I'm going to return to each of those in more detail in due course. But before turning to look in more detail at the issues that are to be covered in evidence during our 3 weeks of hearings, we hope that it will be helpful to introduce some historical context. To that end, I propose to spend just a little time explaining how allegations about child sexual abuse at Westminster, and in particular the concept of a Westminster paedophile ring, have developed over time from the 1970s almost to the present day. A very recent point in this narrative was, of course, the 24th of October 2012. That was the date on which, putting a question to the Prime Minister on the floor of the House of Commons, Tom Watson MP claimed that there was, quote, clear intelligence suggesting a powerful paedophile network linked to Parliament and Number 10, unquote. In support of this allegation, Mr. Watson asserted that there had been a failure to follow up evidence obtained in the police investigation into convicted paedophile Peter Wrighton, including evidence that, as he put it, related to a, quote, senior aide to a former Prime Minister, unquote. And looking back, it may be thought that Tom Watson's question was the catalyst for the establishment of this inquiry. And pausing there, Chair, we have a clip, perhaps just to remind us of Tom Watson's question in Parliament, and we have it available to play.
Evidence file used to convict paedophile Peter Wrighton, if it still exists, contains clear intelligence of a widespread paedophile ring. One of its members boasts of his links to a senior aide of a former Prime Minister, who says he could smuggle indecent images of children from abroad. The leads were not followed up, but if the files still exist, I want to ensure that the Metropolitan Police secure the evidence, re-examine it, and investigate clear intelligence suggesting a powerful paedophile network linked to Parliament and Number 10.
Well, the honourable gentleman raises a very difficult and complex case, and I'm not entirely sure which former Prime Minister he is referring to, but what I would like to do is look very carefully in Hansard as to the allegations that he's made, the case that he's raised, and look very carefully and see what the government can do to help give him the assurances that he seeks.
The evidence file used to convict paedophile Peter Wrighton.
Unsurprisingly, Mr. Watson's question gave rise to considerable public concern. His allegation that there was a powerful paedophile network linked to Parliament and Number 10 came at a time of general public disquiet regarding allegations of historical child sexual abuse. Mr. Watson asked his question just 3 weeks after the first allegations about Jimmy Savile had been broadcast on ITV, and only days after the launch of Operation Yewtree. And his question was followed closely by Simon Danczuk, MP, calling in Parliament for an inquiry into alleged abuses by Cyril Smith. These allegations fed into the growing public concern that a network of paedophiles may have operated with a degree of impunity in public life. Concern continued to grow, and some 2 years later, on the 6th of July 2014, in a television interview on the Andrew Marr Show, speaking about a piece Simon Danczuk had written in that day's Mail on Sunday, calling for a public inquiry into historic child sexual abuse in Westminster, Lord Tebbit said that this had to be understood against, as he put it, quote, the atmosphere of the times, unquote, and, quote, at that time most people would have thought that the establishment, the system, was to be protected, and if a few things had gone wrong here and there, that it was more important to protect the system than to delve too far into them, unquote. He added, quote, that view, I think, was wrong then, and it is spectacularly shown to have been wrong because the abuses have grown. Adding a little further, there may well have been, as he put it, quote, a big political cover-up, unquote, related to child sexual abuse in the 1980s, but that it was, he said, almost unconscious, and, quote, the thing that people did at that time, you didn't talk about those sort of things, unquote. And again, we have a clip of that, which I'll invite the trial director to play.
Danczuk's piece in the Mail on Sunday, which I quoted at the beginning of the programme.
What I find we have to do is to remember the atmosphere of the times. It's very easy to forget that things looked different in those days.
Geoffrey Dickens was widely attacked as a kind of buffoon for raising this at the time.
Yes, indeed. He was widely regarded as a chap who was always falling over his own feet. Also, at that time, I think most people would have thought that the establishment, the system, was to be protected. And if a few things had gone wrong here and there, that it was more important to protect the system than to delve too far into them. Now, that view, I think, was wrong then, and it is spectacularly shown to have been wrong because the abuses have grown.
Do you think there was a big political cover-up at the time, back 30 years ago?
I think there may well have been, but it was almost unconscious. It was the thing that people did at that time.
You didn't talk about these kinds of
You didn't talk about those sort of things. It's not the sort of thing that people did, not even, if I may say so, television journalists, let alone the politicians.
Now, Lord Tebbit has provided the inquiry with a witness statement, and we will invite you to adduce that in evidence in due course. In that statement, Lord Tebbit explains what was in his mind when he referred to a big political cover-up by the establishment in relation to child sexual abuse. And at paragraph 1422-21 of this statement, he refers to his awareness of Jimmy Savile's excessive interest in child patients at Stoke Mandeville, the lack of action taken against Cyril Smith for allegedly abusing teenage boys, rumours of sexual deviance of senior members of the churches of England and Rome, and that Peter Morrison had an interest in young men, which Lord Tebbit said he took to mean young men of about sixth form age. As I've said, this surge in public concern about Westminster child sexual abuse allegations in the period following Mr. Watson's parliamentary question in October 2012 not only provides the context for this part of the inquiry's work, but was to a significant degree responsible for the inquiry itself being established. In fact, the setting up of the inquiry in its initial non-statutory form was announced by Theresa May, then the Home Secretary, on the 7th of July 2014, the very day after Lord Tebbett's interview. As you know, it was subsequently reconstituted as a statutory inquiry in March 2015. It would be wrong, however, to suggest that the 2012 allegations of cover-up and conspiracy relating to Westminster child sexual abuse was entirely novel. On the contrary, public allegations of this nature had been ventilated from time to time over several decades before. Political sex scandals are, of course, nothing new. Conspiracy and cover-up were at the heart of the two great political sex scandals of the 1960s and the 1970s, the Profumo and Thorpe affairs. Other high-profile sex scandals during the period involved children. As we shall see, the reporting of such scandals in this period often used the term rent boy, which was and is an ambiguous term in that it doesn't distinguish between individuals below the age of 18, whom this inquiry regards as children, and those over 18. The term seems to have been used generally to describe both teenagers and those in their early 20s. I'll return to this point later in the course of this opening statement. But let me first take a look at the historical context underpinning this investigation. And I begin with Sir Ian Horrobin in 1962. He was Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Power from 1958 to 1959. And he was convicted in 1962 of 10 charges of indecency with boys under 16 and young men who were associated with the Mansfield House University settlement, where Horrobin was the warden. And he was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment, as reported by the Daily Mirror around that time, under the headline, "Great Career of Sir Ian Ends in Jail." Next, Piccadilly Circus and Playland. In the 1970s and the 1980s, the so-called meat rack, or sometimes referred to as the chicken rack, near the Playland amusement arcade at Piccadilly Circus in the West End of London, was notorious as a congregating spot for teenagers and young men. It's been reported that many of these boys and men were solicited and sexually exploited by older men. In 1975, Scotland Yard investigated a number of individuals for sexual abuse of rent boys around Piccadilly Circus. 5 men were charged, including Charles Hornby, a wealthy socialite and an old Etonian, as reported by the Daily Mirror on the 23rd of September 1975 under the headline, "Old Etonian is jailed in rent boy's vice case." Hornby was said to have had royal connections. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to procure acts of gross indecency by males under 21, committing acts of gross indecency and attempting to pervert the course of justice. Much more recently, allegations have been made by individuals in relation to events around Piccadilly Circus in the 1970s. The inquiry requested evidence from Anthony Daly in relation to his book, Playland, Secrets of a Forgotten Scandal, published in 2018. He tells the story of his time as a rent boy when he was aged 20 over the course of 3 months in 1975. Mr. Daly alleges that he was initially captured and recruited by Charles Hornby, and that he became well acquainted with Charles's brother, Simon Hornby, who paid him for sex. Though not a child himself at the time, Mr. Daly alleges that he was forced to witness the depraved sexual abuse of 2 boys, aged 8 and 10, at a party attended by unnamed persons and 2 individuals whom he knew. He also made claims in his book that senior establishment figures, including politicians such as Sir Keith Joseph, Sir Peter Morrison, and Sir Michael Havers, the then Shadow Attorney General, were present at parties where underage rent boys were sexually abused and exploited. Allegations have also been made in recent years by Anthony Gilberthorpe. Mr. Gilberthorpe has publicly alleged that as a young Conservative activist in the early 1980s, he was given money to procure rent boys for the entertainment of Conservative MPs, including cabinet ministers at party conferences in 1981, 1983, and 1984. Indeed, on the 13th of July 2014, the Sunday Mirror reported his allegations under the headline, "I supplied underage rent boys for Tory ministers." He's named in the public domain a number of prominent politicians who he claims were involved with rent boys, including Dr. Alistair Smith, by then Attorney General Sir Michael Havers, Sir Rhodes Boyson, and Sir Keith Joseph. I make perfectly clear, in light of recent press, that we have received no witness statement from him and we are not calling him. The Elm Guest House was a hotel in Brox Lane near Barnes Common in southwest London. It has been associated with allegations of child sexual abuse ever since the 1980s. It was run by husband and wife Haroon and Carol Kazir and was advertised as a gay guest house. In June 1982, the Elm Guest House was raided by police. It appeared that at least 1 boy, aged 10, had been sexually abused on the premises. The boy made a statement to police in which he said that he had been raped by adult males at the house. A social worker quite separately claimed that the boy made an allegation in relation to an Uncle Leon that was not reflected in the boy's formal typed statement. A masseur who worked on the premises, then aged 17, has also claimed that 2 undercover officers had sex with him in the guest house before the raid, and that he was intimidated by officers not to speak the truth about what he knew. Following the raid, the Kazirs were taken into custody. In April 1983, Carol and Haroon Kazir were convicted of running a disorderly house. They were each sentenced to 9 months imprisonment, suspended for 2 years, and fined £1,000. None of the guests at the house was convicted of any offence, and no politician or VIP was ever identified as having been involved. In June 1990, Carol Kazir was found dead. At the inquest into her death, which was ruled a suicide, Mr. Chris Fay, an employee of the National Association of Young People in Care, or NAPIC for short, alleged that he had spoken to Carol Kazir with his colleague, Mary Moss, and the so-called Mary Moss list of VIP guests to Elm Guest House was produced during these interviews and later published online. Mr. Fay alleged that Kazir informed him that boys were trafficked from Grafton Close Children's Home and abused by VIPs in the guest house. And the Sunday Mirror reported that under the headline, House of Porn, ex-cabinet minister pictured with naked boys in sauna. Years later in 2015, Mr. Fay repeated his allegations on a BBC Panorama programme entitled The VIP Paedophile Ring, What's the Truth? And that went out on the 6th of October 2015. Fay also made claims that Kazir had shown him photographs in which a semi-naked Leon Britton was in the guest house with naked boys. He added that he had spoken to a number of alleged victims, but it was clear that his allegations were refuted in full by at least one of those individuals. His allegations have been the subject of investigation by the IOPC in Operation Merita, about which you will hear further evidence this week. Chris Fay, for his part, was jailed in 2011 for an unrelated offence of money laundering. Elm Guest House has been linked also in the press to the disappearance of Vishal Mehrotra, an 8-year-old who vanished on the day of the royal wedding in 1981. His remains were found in Sussex in February 1982. Moving on, Jeffrey Prime. Jeffrey Prime was a former intelligence officer and Soviet spy. He worked for the RAF and later GCHQ during the 1960s and the 1970s. Prime had made a set of 2,287 index cards containing details of individual girls, their activities, and their parents' routines. In 1982, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of sexual offences against children, as well as espionage offences. He was sentenced to 35 years imprisonment for the espionage offences, with 3 years imprisonment to run consecutively for the sex offences. In November 1982, Geoffrey Dickens MP asked Prime Minister Thatcher about Prime's membership of the Paedophile Information Exchange, commonly known as PI, and Mrs. Thatcher responded that she understood that such stories were false. Which brings me to PI and Peter Heyman. The Paedophile Information Exchange, or PI, was an organisation formed in 1974 as part of the Scottish Minorities Group. In 1975, the year following, it relocated to London. Its aim was to campaign against the laws on the age of consent in order to allow adults to have sex with children. Its members published in its publications Understanding Paedophilia, as well as a publication known as Magpie. And we're going to look at some examples, please, of that publication so we can get a flavour. We can see the date of it is April 1977, issue number 2. We can see the headline La Gazza Ladra, taken from an Italian opera, The Thieving Magpie. Being paedophile is a lonely business. It reads, but I don't need to tell most of my readers that. However, it was with a rare sense of communion with our members that I settled down to watch Mark Lester in Eyewitness one Sunday evening last month, and on it goes. And on the right, Magpie aims to provide paedophiles with their own journal and to further the understanding and acceptance of true love for children in today's society. So that gives us a fairly firm understanding of what Pi was all about. If we turn on, please, to page 5, so _5. Top left, survival, and it's the printing on the top right. From time to time, members ask us for advice on matters which may be of general interest. One such question concerned the law about the import of photographic material, such as boys' international type photos. And the rest of that piece goes on about that theme. And then on to page 7, please. _7. We've taken out addresses, but we can see what this is. World paedophile groups are listed, including Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, West Germany, the United States, Holland, Norway, Switzerland. And with a little request right at the bottom, we'd be grateful for information about groups in other parts of the world. Thank you. Can we go on then to the next one I'd like to draw attention to, and that is LSE 000754, beginning at page 1. Drawing of a boy, issue number 7, September 1977. And then to page 3. On the left, the tale of Tom O'Carroll. I'm not going to go through it, but right at the bottom we can see who the author is, Charles Napier. And then on the right-hand side, under the heading Paedophilia, what are we talking about, by Dr. Fritz Bernhard, a psychiatrist, sociologist and writer. So on occasions Magpie would feature intellectual articles on the subject. And then please page 5. Pie in the New World, map of North America and indeed South America, but pointing out the numbers of perhaps members, Pie members in the New World, including Hawaii. Next month, printed upside down, Australia. And the next issue, please, I'd like to draw attention to LSE 001252, beginning at page 1, issue 11, May 1978, with a drawing of a child. And then the next page, page 2, and under the irrelevant box, can we highlight NCCL supports Pie's rights, National Council for Civil Liberties, now Liberty. At the recent annual general meeting of the National Council of Civil Liberties, a motion was passed which is of particular importance to Pie, bearing in mind the events of last August and September. Accordingly, we reprint this motion, number 39, in full. The AGM reaffirms the right of free discussion and freedom to hold meetings for all organisations and individuals doing so within the law. Accordingly, whilst reaffirming the NCCL policy on the age of consent and the rights of children, particularly the need to protect those of pre-pubertal age, this AGM condemns the physical and other attacks on those who discussed or attempted to discuss paedophilia, and reaffirms the NCCL's condemnation of harassment and unlawful attacks on such persons. And if we scroll down a bit further, Pie is affiliated to the NCCL, and we have long advocated that our members should join as individuals so that they may participate in and benefit from the activities of this large and long-established organisation, and the address of the NCCL is given. And then on the next page, please, which is page 3, again another article, Paedophilia, the Effects. This one under the authorship of a man, I think, who goes by the name of Bron Gersma. And we can see within the parallel lines, the quotations first on the left. The child is definitely not a non-sexual being, but has its sexual impulses right from its birth. And then to the next column, between those parallel lines, a sexual relationship between a child and an adult does not harm the child, may even be beneficial, provided the adult partner is considerate, loving, and affectionate. And then on to the second page, first column. Most penal laws will punish a man who fondles a child erotically much more severely than a man who batters a child nearly to death. And then the next column at the top, could real love, affection, sympathy, tenderness ever have a bad effect on the evolution of a human being? So that is the kind of stuff that Pi was peddling. And then the next issue, LSE 001258. Page 2 of that only, please, page 2. The issue date or period is October to December 1979 for this one. But this has some importance in the context of the issue. In this case, under editorial, if we can highlight under the heading Blood, Sweat and Tears Department, the continuing crisis. So all of that column below, please. Many thanks to those who have sent in money and offers of help in the present crisis. Those who have contributed, some very generously, still only make up a small proportion of the total membership, however. And although the Defence Committee has got off to a sound financial start, Pi's general financial state is now looking grim, thanks to the soaring cost of producing Magpie. We hope to recoup costs by selling in big city bookshops, in brackets any volunteers to help with the distribution. But in the meantime, funds are desperately needed, and from now on, donations should be sent simply to Pi, not the Defence Fund, until further notice. Response to the questionnaire in the emergency bulletin has shown a gratifying to us degree of confidence in the Executive Committee, although this does leave us with an unenviable burden of responsibility for some major questions. Briefly, the EC, the Executive Committee, recently decided, one, to bring out this issue of Magpie in unchanged format. Later issues, unless money is forthcoming, will have to be much less lavishly produced. And so that's all of that one that I draw to attention. And then finally, in this regard, LSE 001261, LSE 001261, beginning at page 1. We can see the date of it. It is spring 1981, and the relevance of that and the cuttings on the front page relate to Tom O'Carroll, who was on its executive committee and sometime chair, and was, I'll come back to this later, but was jailed on a retrial in March 1981, so that's what these headlines are all about. And at the bottom left, Tom jailed. Tom O'Carroll was sentenced on March 13th to 2 years imprisonment for conspiracy to corrupt public morals. He alone was convicted. His 3 co-defendants were cleared of all 6 charges against them. Excuse me. And on the next page, page 2, on the left-hand side, we have, can we just blow up the left-hand side, please? Just the left-hand side. The whole of the left-hand side. Thank you. Mid-trial summary, Pi 4, Crown 0. We won't go through it now, but if we go to the bottom right of the third column, the bottom right of the third column, and you'll see there reference to obscene Detective Sergeant Brian Collins, who was ordered to raid Pi members' homes following an item in the Gutter Press. well, the piece is all about the trial. Brian Collins is somebody we will hear from who was involved, indeed, as the article indicates, in the investigation of Pi, as well as one other important aspect of what we're going to hear about. And then please, page 6. On the right-hand side, Iicsa Appeal 1980. In February of last year, an appeal for assistance in the fundamental work of the Executive Committee was distributed to the membership. At that time, the very continuation of Pi lay in the balance, and not because of police action or the impending prosecution, but because inevitable attrition had worn the EC down to a handful of members, and the energies of those remaining few were on the point of exhaustion. The work of maintaining our organisation is such that many routine secretarial duties, specific research tasks, publicity of information gathering projects can be assigned to members who are either unable or unwilling to attend the regular EC meetings, which are held every month in London. And in many cases, our membership outside the UK can make a very real contribution to this work. We accordingly made our appeal in the belief that the majority of our members would be willing to make some active contribution, however small, to the survival of our group, and that even those who felt they couldn't do so would welcome the opportunity to reaffirm their support for our endeavours. In this sense, the appeal was also a vote of confidence, and the diagram opposite shows how you responded. And on it goes, requesting help and assistance. So those are the examples, and that's all they are, of aspects of Magpie. Pi's philosophy was also asserted in Tom O'Carroll's book, Paedophilia, The Radical Case, published in 1980. As I say, he was a member of Pi's executive committee and a former secretary and chair of Pi. It's also clear that a number of Pi members were involved in the sexual abuse of children. High-profile members, Peter Wrighton, Charles Napier, one of the names we saw in, as the author of the ode or the tale of Tom Carroll, Richard Alston, and Dr. Maurice Fraser, were all convicted of offences related to child sexual abuse in 1981. A number of senior Pi members, including Tom O'Carroll, as we just saw, were tried for conspiracy to corrupt public morals on the basis of contact advertisements published in Magpie. And it was following a retrial that O'Carroll was convicted and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. He later admitted and was sentenced to jail for offences of child pornography, and it's believed that Pi disbanded in 1984. There were a number of established links between Pi and Westminster in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Others are the subject of conjecture. First, at least one senior Westminster figure, Sir Peter Hayman, former High Commissioner to Canada, was a member of Pi, albeit using the name Peter Henderson. In October 1978, Hayman left a package of indecent images of children on the London bus. The police traced the package and discovered that Hayman, under the pseudonym Peter Henderson, had used an apartment in Bayswater in London to conduct obscene correspondence, including with Pi members. As a result, 7 men and 2 women were named by the Metropolitan Police as possible defendants in a report submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions, Sir Thomas Hetherington, but he advised against prosecution. In 1981, Geoffrey Dickens MP revealed these events in Parliament and asked why Hayman had not been prosecuted. The Attorney General, Sir Michael Havers, indicated that the material he had received was not of an extreme nature and didn't warrant prosecution, that Hayman was not a member of the PI executive. Second, it's been claimed that PI was funded by the Home Office. The claim originates from Mr. Tim Hulbert. Mr. Hulbert was a consultant at the Home Office Voluntary Service Unit, or the VSU, from October 1977 until he became Deputy Director of Social Services for Hereford and Worcester County Council in October 1981. The VSU was responsible for providing funding to voluntary organisations that were not the direct responsibility of any single government department. Mr. Hulbert recalls seeing a quarterly summary of pending grants or grants for renewal with an entry that read WRVS in brackets PI. He went to Clifford Hindley, the head of the unit at the time, and asked why the VSU was funding PI. Mr. Hulbert says that Mr. Hindley told him that PI was funded at the request of Special Branch, who found it useful to identify people with paedophile inclinations. Mr. Hulbert was left, he says, with the clear impression that he should back off. In February 2013, the then Home Secretary commissioned an independent Home Office review to ascertain what information the Home Office had received in relation to organised child abuse and whether there had been any deliberate destruction of documents to protect persons of public prominence. There was an interim report that was published in April 2013 and a final report published in June 2013. A second Home Office review examined Mr. Hulbert's claim about Home Office funding of PI. Its report, published in July 2014, concluded that on the balance of probabilities and in the absence of supporting evidence, the alleged funding by the VSU of PI did not take place. However, it found that organisations connected to PI were funded by the Home Office, including the Albany Trust and the Princedale Trust. The independent review of both Home Office reviews, conducted by Peter Wanless and Richard Whittam, Queen's Counsel, considered that this was not a fully satisfactory answer. In their report, published in November 2014, they concluded it was possible that a special branch-inspired payment might have taken place. The official records offered no direct evidence of this, and there was nothing to corroborate Mr. Hulbert's memory, but the records were insufficiently complete to rule it out entirely. Several months later, a further store of documents was found at the Home Office, which were the subject of a supplementary review by Messrs. Wanless and Whittam. Third, PI was permitted to be, and we've seen an indication of that already, PI was permitted to be an affiliate organisation to the National Council for Civil Liberties, the NCCL, from the late 1970s until the early 1980s. Patricia Hewitt, Harriet Harman, and Jack Dromey all had roles in the NCCL at the time. Each has more recently held senior positions in the Labour Party. They have all expressed regret for NCCL's affiliation with PI and have claimed no personal support for its members. It appears that there was a substantive relationship between the NCCL and PI nonetheless. In March 1976, the NCCL proposed the reduction of the age of consent to 14, and in some cases 10. They issued a press release stating, quote, NCCL proposes that the age of consent should be lowered to 14 with special provision for situations where the partners are close in age or where consent of a child over 10 can be proved, unquote. something which The Guardian reported on much later in February 2014 under the headline, Patricia Hewitt-backed NCCL policy of lowering age of consent. A version of the policy was then adopted as a recommendation by Home Office advisors in a 1979 paper. The NCCL also advertised in Pye's publication, Understanding Paedophilia, in 1977, and in Pye's magazine Magpie in April 1979. In addition, Tom O'Carroll was elected to the NCCL's Gay Rights Subcommittee in the late 1970s. The NCCL Gay Rights Subcommittee chair, Nettie Pollard, attended Pye meetings and also wrote letters in support of Pye. Which brings me to the Dickens dossier. Geoffrey Dickens was a campaigning MP who used parliamentary privilege to name senior diplomat Sir Peter Hayman as a paedophile in the House of Commons, and alleged that Hayman's paedophilia had been covered up by the Attorney General. In 1983 and 1984, he had a series of meetings with the Home Secretary Leon Brittan, at which he provided information purporting to identify other high-profile paedophiles in government, as well as the royal household. The information he provided has come to be known as the Dickens dossier. But what exactly was in the Dickens dossier and how many there were is unclear. The evidence suggests there may have been several files or documents which have individually and perhaps misleadingly become known as the Dickens dossier or dossiers. There are claims that in 1983, a copy of the dossier was seized under threat of imprisonment from journalist Don Hale, which added to the intrigue. Mr. Hale was the editor at the time of the Bury Messenger, and he had been given substantial parts of the Dickens dossier by Barbara Castle, MP, as she was, who had herself received it from Mr. Dickens. Mr. Hale alleges that special branch officers burst into his office and demanded that he hand over the material he had received from Barbara Castle, whereupon he was handed what purported to be a D-notice preventing publication of any material contained within the seized documentation. In relation to the Dickens dossier, the interim report of the first Home Office review concluded that the Home Office did receive information from Mr. Dickens in 1983 and 1984 about alleged child abuse, and that copies of the material had not been retained. However, a letter dated the 20th of March 1984 from Home Secretary Leon Brittan to Mr. Dickens confirmed that the information was considered at the time and any matters requiring investigation were passed to the police. The review did not find evidence of deliberate destruction of documents to cover up child abuse. In their review, Messrs. Wanless and Whittam found that those conclusions were reasonably open to the reviewer on the available information. Scallywag magazine. In the early 1990s, a series of articles concerning an alleged Westminster paedophile ring were published by the controversial magazine Scallywag, edited by Simon Regan. And the allegations published included that there was a paedophile ring in Westminster involving at least one former cabinet minister, that pictures and videos of a paedophile nature had been copied and distributed in Westminster, that the paedophile ring was an all-party affair, though predominantly in the Tory party. The parties were held at Dolphin Square involving sexual and violent conduct towards young boys, that reporting of these allegations was suppressed, and that the situation was well known outside of Westminster, and that several police officers were complicit. Allegations were frequently linked to homosexuality. These articles, while written in a sensationalist style and relying on rumour and innuendo rather than evidence, added oxygen to the rumours already reported in the public domain. Peter McKelvey. Mr. McKelvey is a child protection specialist and social services employee and consultant. He has campaigned against paedophile activity in this country, and he has made frequent allegations in the press. Many of his allegations concern the case of Peter Wrighton, a convicted paedophile who, prior to his conviction, held a senior position advising the government on childcare. In June 1994, Peter McKelvey's allegations concerning Wrighton formed the basis of an inside story documentary, Children at Risk, The Secret Life of a Paedophile, which told the story of Peter Wrighton and two other convicted paedophiles with links to the establishment, Richard Alston and Charles Napier, who I've already named. Mr. McKelvey has previously claimed to have been the source of Tom Watson's 2012 parliamentary question, in which Mr. Watson alleged, as we saw, that there was clear intelligence of a powerful paedophile network linked to Parliament and Number 10. In a witness statement that he has very recently provided to the inquiry, Mr. McKelvey has suggested that Mr. Watson's question was primarily based on information provided by two others. It's certainly the case that Mr. McKelvey has subsequently been reported as suggesting that Mr. Watson acted precipitately in asking the question in Parliament, and that the language he used did not reflect the information that Mr. McKelvey had given him. It was reported by the Telegraph in 2015 that Mr. McKelvey said that, quote, Tom Watson mixed up his facts and made exaggerated claims about a powerful paedophile network linked to Downing Street. And if we go, please, to inquiry reference INQ 004098. I would never have wanted Tom Watson to do a PMQ as a tactic until he heard the whole story. The only thing I wanted to say about politicians is every institution has abusers in it. The more powerful people are, the more likely they are to get away with it. I never talked about rings. And this article was published on the 27th of October 2015. Thank you. Mr. McKelvey has made a number of more specific allegations. He raised concerns about a paedophile network between four individuals, and that a police investigation into it had been shut down because of interference by senior police officers or politicians. He raised concerns that Charles Napier had obtained a teaching post abroad through his establishment connections, and that the same person had made use of or had been allowed to use the diplomatic bag while working abroad in Cairo to send or receive child pornography, and that this hadn't been investigated. Mr. McKelvey was also concerned that individuals in the establishment should have known about Charles Napier's abuse of children. He was concerned that these allegations weren't pursued with sufficient rigour by police. In his recent witness statement, which will be disclosed to call participants and which we will invite you to adduce, Mr. McKelvey summarises his main concerns at paragraph 53. Quote, in summary, I consider that the Peter Wrighton case and the evidence uncovered by the police during their investigations provided powerful evidence of a long-term and widespread paedophile network. Based on the evidence obtained by the police and seen by me, it appears clear that a number of the persons involved in the paedophile network were prominent individuals, I consider that the evidence shows that there was a failure to properly or fully investigate the full extent of the paedophile network, unquote. The inquiry has also received a large volume of documentation from Mr. McKelvey. And those documents have been reviewed and they've been analysed in detail, and where relevant to the scope of this investigation, they've been disclosed or will be disclosed to core participants. The IOPC investigated 9 separate areas of concern raised by Mr. McKelvey in an operation named Red Rail 2, to which we will return during the IOPC evidence. The conclusion drawn by the IOPC, having investigated all of the areas of concern, was that there was no evidence or corroboration to support any of them. Since 2012, in the wake of the revelations regarding Jimmy Savile and Mr. Watson's parliamentary question, many of these old allegations have been revisited. There has, for example, been extensive further commentary and debate concerning both events at the Elm Guest House and what became of the so-called Dickens dossier. Many fresh claims of child sexual abuse relating to this earlier period, in particular the 1980s, have been made since 2012. I've already referred to the allegations and claims made by Anthony Gilberthorpe and Anthony Daly. Most prominent of all were the claims of Carl Beach, or Nick, of a Westminster paedophile ring in Dolphin Square, first made public in 2014 and the subject of the Metropolitan Police's Operation Midland. And claims have also been made by retired police officers to the effect that investigations into prominent individuals suspected of involvement in child sexual abuse were suppressed in the 1980s and earlier. As I have said, one of the central reasons why this inquiry was established was in order to respond to the public concern generated by the wave of allegations regarding historic child sexual abuse that were made between 2012 and 2014. It's important to recognise that other reviews and inquiries have already investigated some elements of this public concern. As I've already mentioned, questions around the Dickens dossier or dossiers, the issue of Home Office funding of PI, they've been investigated by internal Home Office reviews and by the Wanless-Whittam review. And as we shall hear, allegations of police misconduct in respect of Westminster child sexual abuse allegations have been investigated by the IOPC. These reviews and inquiries are not only of historic interest. Given the wide remit of this inquiry, it would plainly be foolish to duplicate work already done satisfactorily by others. And the inquiry's terms of reference expressly require you to build on such work by considering, quote, all the information which is available from the various published and unpublished reviews, court cases and investigations which have so far concluded. Close quote. And perhaps that's a good place for me to conclude for the mid-morning break.